is practically disingenuous and unethical for us to contextualize the war in Gaza based on what happened on October the 7th. It's not enough. October the 7th is nothing in comparison to the decades of violence and the decades of systematic ethnic cleansing campaign against Palestinians in Gaza, right? So my point is not necessarily that we should not acknowledge the atrocities that were committed by Hamas on October the 7th. Obviously, it's relevant, but we have to understand that violence happens in a context, right? If you grab a group of people and basically have them in the largest open air prison in the world, this is not my word, this is the word of many, many people. This is how literally scholars have described it. I mean, even the former British Prime Minister, conservative Prime Minister David Cameron, describes Gaza as an open air prison. If you have these people in an open air prison and then they respond to you with violence, you don't then turn around as the colonizer and start to cry and play victim, even though you spent centuries or decades colonizing and committing atrocities, and then expect that they would not respond with violence. So obviously the natural instinct is to respond and fight back, and that's what the Palestinians have done, and that's what Hamas did. And we have to contextualize Hamas. Although they've done things that are bad, but Hamas wouldn't have existed without Israel's colonization of that whole land. And the fact that they've put people in an open air prison. Remember, most of the members of Hamas are people who've watched their family members being slaughtered, murdered by Israel. So they joined that organization because they wanted to fight back. Now, I'm not creating any defense for Hamas. I'm just understanding things from their perspective on how they came to be in existence. And how they came to be in existence is largely the result of Israel's colonization of the land. We have to acknowledge that. But then to be able to even go any further to this complex history, although some people would argue that it's not as complex as we would like to make it out to be honest. But we have to look back to somewhere around 1948. This was a time in history where just after the end of the war, basically, the British government handed Palestine to Israel in what was known as the Balfour Declaration, although the Balfour Declaration was something that was written in 1917 by the British Foreign Secretary at the time, Arthur Balfour, which basically was written to the Zionist community by promising them land in Palestine, by promising them land in Palestine, which belongs to Arabs, Palestinians. So that's really how the conflict started. So we cannot talk about October the 7th without acknowledging all the historical realities and all the displacement and dispossession of Arab or Palestinian land that took place. Right? And it's a natural instinct for people to want to fight back if they are being colonized. It's their natural instinct to want to fight back. It's important because that period in 1948 is what was known as the Nakba. So Nakba is basically, in Arab, it's an Arabic word for catastrophe, basically. So catastrophe. And during the Nakba in 1948, so the Nakba was a war, is an Israel-Arab war basically, which led to the displacement of 600,000 Palestinians. So there was a country known as Palestine at the time. So Palestine existed at the time. There was nothing like Israel. Israel was promised that land by Britain in what was known as the Balfour Agreement, the Balfour Declaration, excuse me. They were promised that land, but the land was not Britain's at first to be promising someone else, somebody else's land. So then during the Nakba, that's how Israel came to fruition. That's how Israel became a nation. That's how Israel realized statehood. Israel realized statehood through the displacement and the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. So then we can't sit down and try to contextualize this whole conflict simply based on what happened on October the 7th. Now, there's no moral justifications of murder, but I'm just saying that violence happens in a context. And just like I've mentioned initially, if you colonize and brutalize and dispossess people for centuries or for decades, these people are going to respond back with violence. And then once they do, you can't then turn around and play the victim by saying, oh, I'm the victim of violence. You can't be the victim of violence. You're a colonizer. Imagine hypothetically, somebody came into your house, invaded your house, took your wife, took your children away from you, and you came back to fight that person to take your property, your house, and then take back your family. But then when you fight back and attack him, he claims that you're being violent. He claims that you're being brutal, that you're a terrorist. You see how ridiculous that sounds? So that's the same way. That's a simple way of trying to contextualize this conflict to the average person who doesn't understand the historical, economic, political aspects of this conflict. But, I mean, the role Western governments or Western media has played, especially Western governments, have played in meddling this conflict is immense. It is immense. From the foundation, not only did Britain pave the way for the creation of Israel as a nation at the expense of Palestine, but the British government, along with the American government and the French government and the German government and many other Western political powers have literally been in support of Israel, not only helping Israel from its inception, but also provided military aid to Israel in their quest to destroy Palestine. So Britain was not innocent, along with America. So I think what's happening right now is that we've had foreign workers from Britain who were working in Gaza, helping refugees. They were killed by Israel soldiers or Israeli bombings, and then that became a big story. So what became a big story is the fact that 2 British workers, aid workers, were killed. What about the 30,000 children, or 30,000 people, 50 to 70% of them being children, murdered? No conversation about that, right? Anytime somebody tries to bring that up, anytime somebody tries to have a conversation about why is it that 70% of people that were murdered by Israel were children, people are like, Israel has the right to defend itself. That's the conversation. Israel has the right to defend itself. Against who? Against babies. 70% of that 30,000 were children or women. So are you arguing now that little babies can be part of Hamas? Like, what are they talking about? And then when people make that argument, the response or the rebuttal to that argument is, well, Israel has the right to defend itself. Right to defend itself from newborn babies. That is crazy. And Britain has supported the British government, to be more specific, right? The British people have been in total condemnation of this violence. Not all, but the significant majority of our population can see through the bullshit, are against it. But it feels like the British government is still in support of this ethnic cleansing campaign. Not only the conservative government, because normally in the political arena, you might have one government in support of it and the other government against it. But both the Tories and the Labour Party are in support of Israel's campaign to destroy Gaza in total support of it. So Britain is definitely not innocent from that regard. The role that Zionism has played in creating this whole mess is ridiculous. I don't have a problem with Zionism as a philosophy. I genuinely do not have a problem with it, right? As a philosophy, I think one of my big issues is political Zionism. This idea of supremacy, this idea of entitlement, of something that belongs to somebody else, but because you believe that God told you 2,000 years ago that that particular area belongs to you because of your religion. Number one, how far back can you go? 2,000 years ago. And number two, most people do not believe in religion. And if you live in a democratic country, I'm assuming within that democracy, your society or your political sphere is secular, meaning that religion doesn't influence most of your political decisions. And they claim that Israel is the only democratic country in the Middle East. So why are you trying to steal somebody else's land based on what God told you 2,000 years ago? It just makes no logical sense. Right, to the average logical person. So my issue is with political Zionism, not Zionism from its inception or foundation. I think Zionism in itself was basically founded by the Theodore Herzl. So he's the founding father of Zionism, which a concept that he came up with somewhere around 1896. As he noticed that Jewish people were facing a lot of religious and racial intolerance everywhere they go. So he argued that the only way we could solve the problems of racism or anti-Semitism that Jewish people are facing is by Jewish people having their own nation, their own state. So that's what he argued. So in his pamphlet, in 1896 pamphlet, he called the Judenstaat. So basically, he's an Austria-Hungarian Jew. In his pamphlet, 1896 pamphlet, he called the Judenstaat. He envisioned the foundation of a future of a Jewish state for Jewish people. But unfortunately, I don't have a problem with that philosophy of having a state for Jewish people. But the problem is when your philosophy or your idea of supremacy comes at the expense of other people's suffering. So in this particular scenario, their desire for a land for Jewish people came at the expense, not only at the expense of Palestinians, but at the ethnic cleansing of Palestinian people. Palestinians have been robbed of their lands. Palestinians have been robbed of their land. They've been ethnically cleansed. Like 600,000 people in the Nakba in 1948 were displaced from Palestine. And the vast majority of these people were literally dumped into Gaza. Gaza is one of the most overpopulated, densely populated places on earth, right? A small city with millions of people living there, which about 50% of them are children. And when Israel was bombing, after October the 7th, bombing Gaza, 70% of the people that died were women and children, and 30,000 people in 6 months have been slaughtered. Right? The only time we've seen anything remotely similar to this level of violence is the Rwandan genocide of 1994. Nothing else comes close. And we have to argue because a lot of Jewish people at the end of the day are the descendants of Holocaust victims. So I understand their history. I don't understand their history as much as they do, but I empathize with their history. But to go through what you've gone through with regards to your history and then turn around and replicate the same level of violence against other people, I thought the whole point of existence or being is to learn from our sufferings and not replicate or perpetuate the same level of suffering or violence or inflict the same level of suffering or violence against other people, except that the state of Israel does not care. right? They're basically repeating the same against Palestinians. Genocide against Palestinians on a scale that we've never seen since the Rwandan genocide of 1994. Ridiculous. Absolutely, absolutely ridiculous. And I think, obviously, just like I've mentioned, the Holocaust, we have to acknowledge the role that Germany and the hypocrisy that Germany is playing. I think there's a German guilt in this conflict. Germany has been the biggest cheerleader for Israel, right? But why would Germany be the biggest cheerleader for Israel? Well, Germany was the country during the Second World War, or before that time, who have literally not only dispossessed or displaced Jews, but literally slaughtered 6 million Jewish people. So Germany have always tried, they've always had this guilt. So they're basically trying to repent or restitute what they've done in the Holocaust, basically. So if Germany was critical of Israel, right, and then Germany was accused of anti-Semitism, do you see how this can bring back memories of the Holocaust? So Germany, without any evidence or without any historical context of this conflict in Gaza, sided with Israel. I mean, just recently, Nicaragua brought Germany to the International Court of Justice because they argue, Nicaragua argued that Germany is supporting genocide, right? So there's that German guilt in this conflict. And I think, although I understand the history of Germany and Jewish people, but we have to be able to acknowledge facts first before any level of guilt, right? You know what I mean? I understand that the guilt exists, right? But there's nothing more important than actual facts in this conflict, right? So that's what it is. So my whole argument really is that it is fundamentally not enough to contextualize the violence of October the 7th as being the all and end all and all of the actual violence. No, it's not enough. We have to contextualize the conflict based on what happened from the creation of Israel as a nation. And Israel as a nation was created through violence. It was created through supremacy and this idea of Zionism, which was created at the expense of Palestinians. 600,000 Palestinians were displaced from their lands, and they had children who were born in densely populated areas. And Israel carried on an ethnic cleansing campaign where the significant majority of these populations have been murdered by Israel. We have to acknowledge that. So October the 7th might matter, but October the 7th happened in a context. So it's important to understand that too. Well, it's important to acknowledge the violence that happened on October the 7th, whilst not disregard the decades of brutal occupation against Palestinians. The decades of brutal occupation against Palestinians, right? Where their lands were stolen, their families were murdered, they were dispossessed from their country, basically. Their whole country was taken away from them, and they were basically put in this small strip of land where some people lived in Gaza and then some people lived in the West Bank, right? You would have assumed that there's no Hamas in the West Bank because there isn't, right? But guess what? There's still settlers from Israel forcing themselves in the West Bank. So like even the West Bank, the people just they can't even have peace from these people. Not even peace. So basically security, freedom, and peace is something that the people of Gaza or the people of Palestine have not realized for 7 decades, all because of Israel's occupation, genocidal intent, Israel's occupation, genocidal intent, and ethnic cleansing campaign. Israel needs to be held accountable for this violence, and I don't think our Western governments should be siding with Israel. And what we notice with Joe Biden himself is that, he's almost stuck between a rock and a hard place. So, the pressure is mounting a lot for Biden, right? Because at the start, him, just like most Western leaders and Western media, all of them were siding with Israel, right? They were Israel's biggest cheerleaders. But at some point, there's been so much murders, 30,000 people slaughtered, that even Biden was like, I need to push back, I need to kind of hang back a little bit, and, because I cannot be siding with Israel. At the start of this violence, Biden showed an unequivocal support for Israel. An unequivocal support for Israel. Now, he's toning down his support a little bit because he knows that there's a genocide going on in in Gaza against Gazans or Palestinians. He knows that now, but he doesn't have the balls to acknowledge it, to be honest. And the election in America is getting ever closer. The election is literally getting closer now. And Biden has already lost the votes for Muslims. The vast majority of Muslims are not going to vote for him. And the vast majority of African Americans are not going to vote for him because he's never done anything for them. Right? So he's under so much pressure. So he's trying to save his skin, basically. So I think he's in massive trouble for siding with Israel. Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, I want to know about your perspective in this conflict. And what do you think? Do you think Israel has a genocidal intent? Should the intent matter or not? Anyways, make sure to smash the like button down below for this video, and make sure to comment and subscribe as well if your notification bell's turned on. Peace.